So Owen Barfield was one of the Inklings, which is this Oxford group that most famously includes C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. Though both Tolkien and Lewis said Barfield had the most innovative ideas, the most radical ideas that deeply influenced them both. They were very great writers. Barfield is a good writer, but he isn't so accessible, I don't think, as Tolkien and Lewis. And in a way, my book is trying to write a book that both conveys Barfield's ideas faithfully, but is accessible, really gets them across. Because, as Barfield himself said, actually, he felt that if Lewis spoke to his times, the middle part of the 20th century particularly, he always felt that he would speak to future times. And he reckoned about 50 years after Lewis's death, which is about now. So I'm hoping that it speaks to you. It's certainly spoken to me very profoundly, actually. Very much changed my view of things, and I hope to convey some of that. Now, he had this idea that consciousness evolves, by which he meant not the Darwinian notion of evolution, although he did think that happens as well, but in a much more recent period of time, he reckoned he discovered how the human perception of what it is to be a human individual, and also to relate to nature, to the cosmos and to the gods, had radically changed. He gained this through his work in philology, the study of words, and broadly speaking he realised that words don't just tell us about how people experience life now, but they're also fossils of consciousness, as he put it. And if you can track back how words have changed meaning, then you can also track back how consciousness has changed as well. And he did this over a period of about 3,000 years, which is roughly the time that there are words written down surviving that convey not just sort of taxes and bureaucracy, which is what words were first used for, but myths and human experience. So particularly he was interested in the Greek period. So Homer, if it was Homer, composed the Iliad and the Odyssey before they were written down, but they were written down about the 8th century perhaps, and they can take us back to maybe the turn of the first millennium. And then he was also very interested in the Hebrew period as well, and how the oldest bits of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, seem to reach back to about 1000 BC too as well, and remember myths really that emerge out of prehistory before that time. So he had a good chunk, about 3,000 years of material to work on, and his genius, and I think he really was a genius, got to it. And he came up with the idea that consciousness goes through broadly 3 kind of phases. He argued that in this very early period, humans experience life through what he called original participation, which is the sense that there's not much difference between what's me and not me, between what's inside and outside, and between what's mortal and immortal, between my creatureliness and other creatures. So you live in this kind of flow of life, this flow of meaning, and religious rituals and myths are designed to help you to navigate that sense of your sense of self coming from the outside in particular. So myths help you with that, religious rituals help you with that, whether they be the everyday libations or the great feasts. They help you navigate through this flow of meaning. Things began to change, he argued, for various reasons which we could pick up in the questions, but things began to change, particularly around the middle part of the first millennium. It's sometimes known as the axial age, Karl Jaspers's idea, which others have picked up on too. It's becoming a more sort of respected notion than perhaps it was when Barfield was alive, but some quite big philosophers and historians of ideas are now picking up on this axial notion. And it's partly why we think of Western philosophy beginning with figures like the pre-Socratics, then Socrates and Plato. And in fact, in the Hebrew tradition, modern biblical scholarship shows that there was a very dramatic thing started to happen in ancient Israel around the same sort of time as well, and particularly with what we now think of as the Old Testament prophets. And then history took over in Israel with the exiles that really helped constellate a new consciousness. And the idea is that this is the kind of the pre-history to Christianity. It builds up through the intertestamental period, which was also the Hellenistic period. So this is the time of Alexander the Great, and then kind of comes to a sort of fruition. It constellates in the figure of Jesus, what Jesus himself said, but then also how people reflect on Jesus, and comes to shape a completely new consciousness that spreads around the Mediterranean in particular, and then becomes more global as well. So now that's the sort of outline. Let's look at some of these images, and let me try and give you some sense of that. The first collection of images which I put there are from more or less from ancient Greece and ancient Egypt, and I think that they illustrate this original participation and this sense of flow, that there's not much difference between what's me and not me, but between what's mortal and immortal. So for example, if you look at the first image there, very well-known image of the Eye of Horus, and I think the way to understand images like the Eye of Horus, these kind of body parts that you often see floating around Egyptian art, is that if you think of your consciousness coming from the outside in, you don't perceive yourself as a kind of human individual collected together that then tries to relate to the outside world, but that you might experience yourself much more as a kind of collection of spirited factions. And it becomes quite natural to think of different organs as related to different factions from the outside, and in particular different gods. And indeed, body parts are associated with gods in ancient Egypt, and I've just picked up on one of the best known ones here, the Eye of Horus. And I think the sense would have been that somehow your experience of seeing would have been connected with Horus, who was a kind of awakening god, a dying and rising god. So he had something to do with spiritual seeing as well. So the sense of the outside in, you start to pick up on these in these Egyptian artifacts. The next picture there is a pyramid, one of the great pyramids of Giza. And we know these weren't built by slaves. They were built by people who were part and parcel of everyday life in Egypt. And they very much fascinate me because I think at the time they were, again, a kind of collective enterprise that made sense for everybody taking part at the level they were taking part. So nowadays we tend to focus very much on what they might have meant to the pharaoh, trying to secure his relationship with the outside, with the immortals, particularly maybe through a celestial theology. But I think that people who built the pyramid would have felt themselves to have been part of that collective experience as well. And it's very fascinating to me that they built a pyramid, a shape that still speaks to us, but we now tend to think of our inner life in pyramidal forms. Perhaps the best known of them is Abraham Maslow's pyramid, which is the hierarchy of needs, whereas where the basic needs that secure safety, food, those kind of things at the bottom, rising to kind of self-actualization at the top. It's a kind of interior version of ancient Egyptian society, you might say. So this is sort of a pictorial way of trying to show how consciousness has changed. It's not actually directly Barfield's way, but he worked on words, but nonetheless I hope it kind of displays it. An area that Barfield did work on much more was on Homer. He was a classical scholar, much like C.S. Lewis and Tolkien. And he noticed that in Homer, particularly in the Iliad, again this outside-in consciousness seems to be dominant. And the picture I've shown here is one of the moments where Achilles is about to strike Agamemnon. If you know the Iliad, you know that Achilles is always angry with Agamemnon. And he's about to kill him this time. But what happens is not that he has a crisis of conscience, which perhaps would be the way we might experience that, but that Athena, the god, appears and pulls back his head and stops him from doing it. And time and again in ancient texts from this period, it's not that they have a kind of inner stirring that changes their behaviour, but a god appears and changes their behaviour. This sense of the outside-in meaning coming as well again. Fourth image has to do with the afterlife. I don't know if you can, it's a bit small, if you can quite make it out. It's actually a Doré image of Dante, in fact, travelling across the Styx. But I rather liked it because it captures something of this older consciousness, which is that when you died, you returned to the ancestors. So in original participation, kin burial grounds are very important. Honouring the ancestors are very important. And it's almost as if your mortal life is a kind of just a peak above ancestral life, and when you die you return to the ancestors. And both in Israel and in ancient Greece these kind of ideas tended to obtain. They're not universal, but they're actually quite dominant, the idea that you're living an ancestral life in your mortal life to which you return, and so place, burial lands and so on are really, really important. There's no sense of the individual, you might say, to have an individual afterlife. You're part of this collective life now, so of course you'd be part of the collective life afterwards, and your individuality would sort of return to that collective state. And then the last image there is an image of an Egyptian individual, a pharaoh perhaps, standing before gods, and pantheism is the natural religious form of this time too, because if you experience yourself as a kind of collected set of spirited factions, so too you'd experience the world around you as full of gods, many gods, gods associated perhaps with different places, God associated with different parts of times of the year, gods associated and with different qualities or experience of life. And so the individual superior, kind of the high-born individual in Egypt is often shown worshipping many gods, and the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the sort of later creation of that, still represents that pantheistic form. Rare occasions when more monotheistic ideas appear in ancient Egypt, most famously with the pharaoh Akhenaten. I think they don't really take, no doubt for political reasons to do with the temples and all that sort of thing, but I think more profoundly because people didn't have a sense of themselves as individuals. And if you think about it, to perceive of a monotheistic God, you've got to have a sort of sense of your own integrity, your own oneness, you might say, to reflect that. If you don't have that inside, then you're not even going to begin to see that there might be a monotheistic God outside. But this begins to change. And the second lot of images that I put there are just one snapshot, but show it very vividly, I think, of how this changed in the Greek period. And because in Greek art, you get the sense of the individual emerging in about 100 years. These three sculptures I've shown down here are all carved within 100 years of each other, in fact. They begin with the very well-known Koroi, and the Kor's the female version, which are these, we would now think of them as kind of archetypal male and female figures. They're not, as it were, Jim who lives next door, they're what it is to be a man in general. And I guess that you'd have had these figures to relate, again from the outside in, construct your sense of self that way. They begin to change, and at first sculptors sort of put little turns in lips, they bend a knee, they start to show more of a worked physique, which looks a bit like an individual rather than a sacred physique, which the old Kors and Korois always have. That the proportions are all very important between different parts of the body and so on. That starts to change. And then, as I say, within 100 years you get these very individual figures appearing. I've shown you the Discobulus there, very famous example. And what's so fascinating, I think, is not just this is an individual, but he's also an individual that's worked on himself. And not just to throw the discus, but when you look at this image, when you look at the sculpture, you have a sense of his inner poise as well. This is someone who's worked on his mental life to become a great athlete as much as his physical life. And I think that these figures were regarded as rather disturbing at first, and because, as it were, when you looked at them, they were calling forth something new in you. They said, as it were, where's your individuality? Like this celebrated athlete has a kind of individuality. So they start this process, I think, of inner life, interiority starting to be born. Again, Barfield tracked it more in words. He looked at how words changed through Homer, through the ancient Greek period, but tracked something very similar through words. Now, I'm very interested in the figure of Socrates. My PhD was on Plato, and I think Socrates became a kind of pivotal figure in this. You might know that Socrates had a relationship with a demon, who he felt was a kind of intermediary between himself and the god Apollo. But what's so interesting about that is this demon always told him what not to do. It wasn't like Achilles and Athena having his head pulled back, as it were, and being shown what to do, almost fatalistically. With Socrates it's changed. He gets these messages saying, don't do that, don't do this. And what's so fascinating about that is that you have to start to work with the gods in a different way. And in particular, you have to cultivate your own sense of agency to become a kind of co-worker with the gods. So this don't do that says, well, what am I supposed to do? So you've got to kind of wrestle with this message from the demon, and then decide what to do, so that your individuality develops as your harmony, you might say, with the divine develops. And the two start to go hand in hand. It's a very profound shift, very, very important one, I think, in Plato. And I think Christianity becomes so pivotal because what the early Christians discern, and personally I think Jesus himself felt this, but this is disputed of course, but nonetheless, certainly in Christianity it becomes very clear to the early Christians that there had lived an individual who was fully identified with the divine. And it was a divine monotheism too, because again, if there's a full individual human, then sight of the full monotheistic God becomes possible. As it were, the mirror of the soul of the individual becomes able to mirror the divine. So it's no surprise, I think, that Christianity is very strongly a monotheistic God, with variants, of course, with the Trinity, but that's sort of, I think, capturing different aspects of this monotheism as it hits us. But nonetheless, the doctrine becomes very strong in Christianity, that Jesus had been fully human and fully divine. And what happens in the mystical tradition is that people realise that, as Meister Eckhart puts it, it's not actually the incarnation that happened 2,000 years ago. He didn't say 2,000 years ago, he said about 1,500 years ago, that matters most, but actually the incarnation that's taking place in you. And this, I think, was the genius of Christianity, that it democratized this experience of yourself, nature, cosmos and the gods. And it became possible, an ideal that everybody could pursue. Not everyone did, of course. It's a very complicated story, full of darkness as well as light. But nonetheless, that's the kind of the progression in the evolution of consciousness. So you have the medieval period, late antiquity in the medieval period, where a participative, what Barfield called a reciprocal participation becomes possible, whereby knowing yourself and your interiority richly, you know the external world richly as well. Very different from the outside in, it more comes from the inside out. And I put figures here like the image of the pelican in her piety. This becomes a very widespread symbol for how you can look at, as it were, the pelican in nature, plucking at her breast to feed her young with her blood, and know that that is both an image of how you might live a moral ideal of sort of self-sacrifice, but also how God lives, sacrificing himself for you too. So, as it were, the book of nature becomes very, very important alongside the book of the Bible, as it's sometimes put. Your interiority reciprocating with the interiority of nature and the cosmos, astrology and so on becomes very important as well, and that imitates or can capture a glimpse of divine interiority too. I put the picture of the Mona Lisa there, at the, perhaps the last flowering of this reciprocal participation in Barfield's terms, because you can gaze at the Mona Lisa endlessly and wonder about what's going on for her interiority, brilliantly captured by Leonardo. And she sort of represents a kind of full humanity as well. Not fully in the sense of perhaps happy, but sort of grappling and wandering and engaging with life. And you get this brilliant Renaissance trope where you have the figure who's fully an individual set against a background that disappears to a kind of invisible horizon, often with a river as well, as if the infinite soul of the individual is represented, captured too, in the infinite depths of the landscape, and again mirroring the infinite depths of the divine. The three elements kind of come together in these Renaissance images, and I think that's why they're so satisfying for us. They kind of speak to us of a consciousness as possible. The fourth image that I put on there, it's an illustration from Dante's Divine Comedy, when Dante's gone into heaven and he's in the sphere of Jupiter. And in the sphere of Jupiter, he has some very powerful revelations, which again I think are absolutely crucial for this shift of consciousness. And in particular in Jupiter, what he experiences is how the individual souls are still fully individual, and yet they're working fully in harmony with the divine. So it's not that individuality, as it were, is extinguished or dissolves or disappears, as is often the case, I think, in older spiritual traditions. I think we now are asked to read these traditions in different ways, where our individuality develops to such an extent that it's fully transparent to the divine, which is what Dante experiences, particularly in Jupiter. I mean, so much so that he even comes across pagans in Jupiter, which, for a medieval Christian is quite a shock. But it's a word, the principle is universal. A full humanity that's individual and therefore different, we're all different. Nonetheless, there's something about how the many reflect the myriad facets of the one that nonetheless are drawn together in the one as well. And so in Christian mysticism, in Islamic mysticism, these kind of mysticisms, in Judaic mysticism as well, particularly these mysticisms that develop after the shift of consciousness, you get this idea of the many and the one becomes a central sort of mystery, because it is a bit of a mystery. We perhaps occasionally get glimpses of it. We can read some Dante and have it expressed, but nonetheless that in a way represents something of the goal of this new spiritual perception and this new experience of consciousness. Now, we don't live in medieval times. Something further has happened, and Barfield understood the emergence of the modern period as a kind of another turn of this great wheel of consciousness. And in particular, it exemplifies how a withdrawal of consciousness into individual life first creates a sense of alienation from the world around you. It leads to crisis. And so in particular, I've put these two images down here, which show a medieval view of an individual crawling through nature, crawling through the cosmos, very famous bookplate, and with the individual as well poking his head through a crystalline sphere and seeing the planets and the stars as well. But he's fully immersed in this scene, as you can see. Whereas the second image I put there is a bookplate showing the Copernican universe. And I think the significance there is not actually so much that suddenly the sun rather than the earth is at the centre of things. That idea had actually been around for quite a long time. But it was just one of many possibilities. The really radical shift is that the two figures in the picture are sat on the outside of the universe looking in. You might say they've become alienated from the cosmos, which has the great benefit that they can study the cosmos in a new way. And so you get the beginnings of the benefits of science, modern science. But poses this problem as how you're going to reconnect with the cosmos, how you're going to get back into it, shown very vividly in this bookplate. And so that is kind of our great challenge now. I think our individuality has moved on another stage as consciousness has turned again. I mean, there's one manifestation of that in this very room, is that I think there are as many women as there are men in this room. We now value the individual so much that we see the individual as more sovereign than, say, gender roles and social stratification in society, which of course was the case in the medieval period. Universal education and so on are now ideas, one person, one vote. That all becomes possible with this new perception of what it is to be an individual, the kind of sovereignty of the individual. So it has great gains. And our challenge is how we can hold on to those gains, but regain the sense of our inner life mirroring fully the divine life, the cosmic life, the life of nature, as Barfield put it, the inside of the whole world. And I think that the way we do that is by using our individuality. And the key, as it were, facility that we now have, Barfield argued, was imagination. Because what imagination does is it kind of generates lots of fantasies within. That's what our inner lives do. I work as a psychotherapist, and you know, working with fantasy is absolutely crucial to try and understand our inner life. Project them onto the outer world. Often they sort of fall flat on their face. You know, they don't seem to connect. They leave us a bit deluded. That certainly happens. But every so often they strike home, and they feel like they open up something that we hadn't seen before. They, as it were, connect with the inside of the whole world. They reconnect with reality. And what's so wonderful about those moments is that you feel your soul expanding, even as the soul of the whole world has expanded as well. Both, as it were, grow, both get bigger. So you've maintained a sense of what it is to be an individual, but also connected back with nature, with the cosmos, with others, and with the divine too. And my final collection of images there are moments where I think that this is kind of happening, and it's where we're the vanguard of a new consciousness, a new reciprocal participation, which Barfield actually talked of as final participation, by which it's meant final in the teleological sense that it's the direction we're headed in. Blake, particularly for us who live here in London, even more so for those of us who live in South London, is an absolute key figure here. I think he was a real vanguard of this new reciprocal participation. He interpreted Christianity very much as calling us to a new imaginative engagement with the world. You know, if you've read any Blake, you know that one of his great calls is Christ the imagination. Very much understanding this romantic notion from the romantic tradition, people like Wordsworth and Coleridge, who are almost contemporaries with him, that our imaginative lives, when they're fully developed, when they're fully discerned, when they fully connect with the world, is itself a mirror of the divine imagination, which actually created, in a kind of Neoplatonic sense, a kind of emanation of the divine is what created the world to start with, what created the cosmos to start with. So I think Blake is absolutely key. I like this image too because you'll know that Blake, it's the image of Blakean angels, you know that Blake also lived with, as it were, the outside world, the vitality, the spiritual beings of the outside world, but often in quite confusing and difficult ways. And I think that that too is part of our challenge now, that you know, whether we have experience of angels, synchronicities, the paranormal, all sorts of often very chaotic experiences, that there's somehow a kind of external life out there that bumps into us or seems to overwhelm us, or sometimes, you know, more clearly speaks to us. I think that working with that as well is an absolutely key part of developing this new sense of reciprocal participation. And if you know anything about Barfield, you know that he was very impressed by Rudolf Steiner. And Rudolf Steiner tried to develop quite a systematic approach to cultivating what he thought of as clairvoyance, the ability to see the inside of the whole world as well as your own interiority. You know, Steiner was very impressed by Christianity too. It's one of the reasons why he split from theosophy, because I think he perceived that that was the next stage in this kind of dispensation that he had to engage with. It also means working on your inner life, to try and understand your inner life a bit more. It's one of the reasons I became a psychotherapist, because I think that's one of the ways that you can understand your inner life a bit more. And the great thing about that is that when your inner life becomes a bit more perceivable to you, you start to see what's more than just your inner life. A kind of space opens up around your interiority that, again, begins to show the interiority that's around you. So you can develop these discerning abilities, as well as having the therapeutic value of feeling, you know, kind of more flourishing and so on. There's the therapeutic, but also the spiritual. Another image down there is an image of the natural world. You can't talk about these things now without talking about ecology, and who knows, the crisis may happen. These cycles of consciousness, this alienation, is very real. It leads to the tragic. It really can do that. But there are, I think, hopes and signs that an ecological awareness is developing too, which at base I think is a spiritual awareness. It's a sense that there is there's vitality, life, consciousness, awareness in the world around us, and that we must learn to relate to that afresh in order that we don't ruin it, and with, as it were, our own desperate needs and our own desperate desires, to, as it were, accumulate materially, you might say, rather than grow spiritually, which I think is the move towards final participation in Barfield's words. This sense that our interiority is so wonderful because it can connect with the inside of everything, with the inside of God, indeed, too. The incarnation that happens now, not just 2,000 years ago. So there's a sort of big history, one full of soul, I hope, unlike a lot of the big histories that you can read in bookshops these days. And it shows, I hope, how the transcendent, the desire for the transcendent, the experience of the transcendent falling in on us, has driven particularly the evolution of our consciousness. I also hope it's provoked a lot of questions. Very simple questions are often the best because they kind of clarify things, or we can develop things in different directions. So maybe we'll turn to that now, and hopefully you have some thoughts and responses to that for another 10 or 15 minutes, and then, needless to say, I'll be upstairs signing copies of the book, which I hope lay out at book length. And again, very much, I hope to give you a felt sense of what this is like. The word felt is really important in Barfield, because the word felt links the intuitive and the intellectual, and that leads to the fullness of experience that he was pointing us towards. But as I was aware of Julian James's book, the Creation of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, something like that. He wrote a review of it, which you can now get online. There's a wonderful website which has been put together particularly by Owen Barfield's grandson, who's actually also called Owen Barfield. I'm very much trying to get his works, both book length and lots of articles and so on that he wrote. But he did a review of Julian James's book. He felt that James was onto something, but he didn't like two things. He didn't like how James seemed to suggest that, as it were, the ancient mind was constantly tripping, was a bit sort of hallucinating a bit. And he felt that actually there was a real wisdom in original participation, a very sophisticated discernment of the consciousness of the inside of the whole world. Hence, you know, very complex pantheism, rituals and so on. But it's just not our consciousness now. But what happens is that we can kind of learn from it indirectly by exposing ourselves to us and being inspired by what we might regain with this difference of individuality. He also felt that the neuroscience was a bit unnecessary and rather got in the way. And he was wary of that because he did fear that one of the real struggles we've got now is to look to, as it were, material evidence as the supreme authority. And lose sight of our spiritual perceptions as having the supreme authority. They need to be tested, they need to be discerned, they need to be worked on, they can certainly be wrong. But he was very wary of what he called residual unprocessed positivism, and felt that we need to move away from that too. But he knew. I think that there's vast industries, including the pop industry in our culture, in search for ecstasy, in search for this sense of connection. Whether it comes through crowds and pop concerts, whether it comes, through I don't know, the psychedelic renaissance. I think the charismatic movement in Christianity is a kind of benign form of ecstasy. You might say it kind of happens on a Sunday morning rather than on a Friday night, which is a sort of slightly safer time of the week. But the question for me always is in a way, so what? We can have ecstasy, but does it really lead to a deeper perception of nature, the cosmos, and the divine? Does it come into dialogue with our rational faculties and our intuitive faculties as well? Does it lead to things like great art, as you know, in the case of William Blake? Does it have ethical import, you might say? So there's a great kind of supernova of these things, as you're kind of pointing out, but it's just the first step, and Barfield, I think, helps us to work out what the next steps might be too. But again, some psychology can perhaps help. You know, if you're into developmental psychology, you know what's happened since Piaget, figures like Robert Kegan now, Ken Wilber, sort of post-Jungian psychologists. One of the things which they're working very hard at doing is developing kind of schema that show how our consciousness can develop from these more immersive kind of consciousnesses where you lose your sense of self to, well, in Robert Kegan's phrase, post-formal consciousness, which, as it were, is both a sense of your own path, your own reason, your own individuality and integrity, but uses that as a kind of platform to experience the diversity of other well-developed experience of consciousness, spiritualities, philosophies, wisdom traditions generally. I guess that you know, these figures are around. I think Barfield needs to join that conversation because he's got something particular to offer, I think. But we need to be promoting that, talking about that, and in a way showing people that there's ways that these ecstasies can go, that there's further revelation to be had than just the party. Not that the party is necessarily about. I suppose the obvious thing to say is that the spiritual path at every step bumps into pride and the desire, the confusion between your own, as it were, capacity to mirror the divine, with confusing that with the sense that you might be divine. And I know in Judaism, for example, I think it's guarded against by never uttering God's name. You can sort of, as it were, breathe it in your spirit, but not utter it, just to remind you that it's separate. Blasphemy and so on are preoccupations of monotheistic traditions. I think there's a sort of spiritual truth here, though, which again comes out very clearly in Christianity, but it has its variants very clearly in other traditions too, which is how dying to yourself is actually the key step to being reborn to a new life. So it's in the story of Jesus, the dying and rising story, where instead of a sort of external sacrifice, as it had been in original participation, it becomes a continual inner process where you need your sense of self, as it were, to take the next step, but you've constantly got to give up your sense of self to welcome in what that step offers. So a kind of inner dialectic, you might say, of sacrifice, dying to yourself, which Christianity popularised in phrases like taking up your cross every day, dying to yourself. It turns into a moral code in the sense of it being a service to others, which I think is a good practice too. But with moral codes, I always feel you've got to remember it's not the whole story. The morality is only good insofar as it leads to the transformation of yourself, because then, as it were, you can see things differently, and it becomes a life in all its fullness rather than a kind of moral burden with which you struggle. But yeah, it's absolutely key question. Yourself. Well, I guess you can look at this a number of ways. You can look at theistic traditions that relate to gods and angels and so on through liturgies that are designed, I think, to convey a sense of that vitality to you. So you have the sense of a holy place will emerge where people have prayed, for example, and the powerful sense that the place carries a liveliness that isn't just your projection. People can clearly tell you it's just your projection, but when you go to these places, as it were, experience would indicate otherwise. I think that as I mentioned before, the kind of plethora of paranormal experiences that people have, of all sorts, often very chaotic. But if you want to read something about this, the psychologist Jeffrey Kripal the American psychologist, is very good on this, about how they're kind of reflexive engagements with the outside world, trying to impress themselves upon us, but using the images that we can half understand. So it's not, as it were, a straightforward communication at all. Again, a bit like Socrates, there's always the personal struggle and wrestling, because a true spiritual path is one where you grow as well as the world around you grows. But I think parapsychology is onto a lot of this, in its more sophisticated forms. And I think ecology is going that way as well. I mean, there's a great fascination with trees at the moment, and the notion of plant intelligence. There's a science of this, which is at one level, but I think it partly draws us, because it's kind of like an awakening that the world is alive. It's not just a machine, as you know, as we were told from early modern science. So in a number of ways, but your own personal development at the end of the day has got to be key, I think, because unless you can work out how to live with this vitality and know it, as it were, more and more, then it still is a kind of open question. About AI and the sort of prophets who predict that an AI is about to become conscious, that, as it were, will become a threat to us. Yeah, they'll sort of they'll be smarter than us and be able to do all sorts of things. My worry about that is not actually that AI is about to emerge. I don't actually see it myself. The more I read about AI, the more I see that human consciousness is something different entirely. I think that AI will do more and more for us, like hopefully, you know, feed us stuff through the internet that we want to see and so on. But my worry about it is that in the adulation of the AI, the fearful adulation of the AI, we lose touch with our own consciousness and the richness of it. You know, I've talked about the imaginative powers of our own consciousness, which is just one side. And it's not just me saying that. There are people like Jaron Lanier, for example, who's very much involved in the development of IT and technologies, but he says this very much, that we need to develop technology without giving up our own sense of self, and that is the great risk, I think.